My name is Ethan Cole, and I'm the president of the Product Managers Association Los Angeles, and I'm happy to welcome you to our first virtual meetup. So a little bit more about, our organization. We're a 100% volunteer-driven, professional, nonprofit organization of 2000 LA's best and brightest product thought leaders. So what we did in the past was that we would put on events pretty regularly at companies across town. So in the past, we've been at Google, Evite, Inspire, BCG Digital Ventures, and be an opportunity for us to share ideas and get together and network. In this new world that we're experiencing right now, the leadership and I have been trying to find ways for us to continue to serve the LA product community. How can we continue to have some of these conversations that we did in the past to help build better product people? So really proud of the team for pulling together this virtual meetup. Please let us know your thoughts on it. So we're going to send out a survey at the end. In general, when we have our meetups in person, we can speak with you before the event. We can take a look at the audience as the event goes on, and we can also check in at the end to have some sort of feedback. In this new format, it's a little more difficult for us. So if you could please let us know if this is something that you'd like to see more of. Let us know if there's something else that you think you'd want to see from PMA in this temporary, new world we are in. Let us know. Along those lines, really excited to talk about a hackathon that we have coming up on Saturday. So we're teaming up with USC. It's called the Hack for Hope. And it's an opportunity for us to use our skills in a productive way. So it's a virtual hackathon, and we'll send out instructions either later today or tomorrow, so be on the lookout. The USC undergrad and grad school students are trying to spend a week building something that is applicable right now in this COVID world. The idea is, hey, let's use our skills for good. And they're on the lookout for product managers and mentors for these teams. And so we're teaming up with that organization. And if you're interested, please let us know. We'll shoot out this email invite, and it'll have a link to a Google form that you can submit an application to join. So we're just trying to find as many ways as we can possible to do what we can given the current circumstances. And without further ado, I'm going to kick it to Joni. Again, kudos to the PMA meetup team. Joni, Mark, David, Malik, Miles, Claire, Rob, Betty, I don't want to forget anyone. Terrific job of pulling this together in such a short amount of time. And I hope you guys find it enjoyable and super productive. So Joni, thank you so much, and why don't you take it from here?
Thanks so much, Ethan. So all of you, I'm really excited that you all were able to join us today for our first ever virtual PMA LA event, and especially during the lunch hour. Usually we have evening events, but in this brave new world, over about the past month, it seems like everything's changed. And part of that, for all of us who can work from home, means shifting to working in a remote environment. And whether we have worked remotely in the past or with remote and distributed teams or not, there are new challenges for all of us. So that could mean having the additional responsibility of homeschooling your kids while also managing your team. And for product people, especially, that it can be a challenging transition. So if we were used to working in an office and going up to folks' desks to get things done, now we have to figure out new fun ways to do that. So today we are incredibly excited and lucky to have Hiten Shah join us to share his tips and tricks for working from home. So Hiten has been working with leading remote and distributed teams for almost 2 decades now. And you may have heard of him as the founder of things like Crazy Egg, Kissmetrics. Today, he's the CEO of a company document search solution called FYI. And he I and he also sends out a very excellent regular newsletter called Product Habits, which I hope that you're subscribed to. If you're not, definitely check it out. It is incredibly useful and helpful. And he's done some extensive work gathering feedback from product managers, among other things, about how everyone is viewing working from home these days. As we get started, just quick thing, we're recording this session, and hopefully we'll be able to share it out with you and anyone who's not able to join us today. So you'll be able to review it later. And if you have any questions for Heaton during the session, just go to the controls at the bottom of your screen and enter your questions in the Q&A section. So, and we'll be reviewing those with Heaton at the end of the call. So without further ado, I'm going to kick things over to Heaton.
Thank you. Super happy to be here. I'll start my video so I can say hi. Hi, everyone. And I'm going to jump right in. Just like Joni said, we're going to have a Q&A, and I actually have it open as well. So please, as I'm talking, feel free to add some questions. We will definitely have time for questions. So yeah, I'm going to jump right in. So who am I? I've been doing remote work for about 17 years. All my companies have been remote, including the one before my software companies called ACS, which was a consulting company. And we were sort of forced into remote, so to speak, because it was much easier to work with clients when we could do it remotely instead of having to go into their office. And since then, I've started multiple different software businesses called Kissmetrics and Crazy Egg. And also my new company is called FYI, which I'll share a little bit more about in context to some of the things I'm going to talk about. So I would say that, funnily enough, I'm not one of those people who is super dogmatic about, hey, you need to be remote, you have to be remote is better, etc. I think I just fell into it, and I'm definitely cool with it. I enjoy it. Our teams are remote, but I also enjoy talking to people in person as well. So one thing I'm going to point out, just like everyone is kind of pointing out, is that this is not business as usual. This is business as unusual. We have so many different factors that we're dealing with today when it comes to working from home across pretty much every industry, every single company on the planet, basically, and things are just different. And I think that's really important to point out. So one thing I said the other day is that managing a remote team is not the same as managing a work from home team. What we're basically managing right now as sort of people in a company or even like individual contributors in an organization is we're having to deal with the fact that everybody's working from home, and it's likely that the scenarios are a lot different than they would be if you were setting up your company to be a remote company, either from day one or if you're transitioning. This is a abrupt transition that has happened for everyone, and the factors and the environment that we're dealing with is very different, including things such as the fact that, like, restaurants aren't open and more people are cooking from home, and there's, masks and gloves, and depending on where you live, all those kinds of rules that you have, and a lot of businesses aren't open either, as well as, your partner, your roommates, whoever working from home as well as your kids being home and having to be schooled at home. So this is just very different. And it's very important to acknowledge that first and foremost. That's why I think a lot of the content about remote work is either half relevant or not relevant at all, because you might not feel comfortable to go take a walk. You are definitely not going to be able to work from a coffee shop right now. And a lot of those things are some of the helpful tips people would give about remote work. Those aren't the ones I'm going to give. So in true sort of product development form, our company FYI started a couple weeks ago asking people in a survey what basically the net promoter score is for working remotely at their company. So the question we asked was, how likely are you to recommend working remotely at your company to a friend or colleague? And this is what we learned. But before I get into that, let me share what the next question we asked. So that was question 4 of the survey. This is question number 5. What we asked is, how often do you normally work remotely? And just like most kind of qualitative and qualitative research, it's really great when you can segment the responses. So we segmented the Net Promoter Score responses, and here's what we learned. People who work from home all the time, they feel like remote work is great. Out of 58, people who work a few days a week, very close, at a 51. People who rarely do remote work are not very satisfied with it. And people who have never done it before are having a bad experience, basically. So that's what we learned. And that's really one of the reasons I'm speaking today, because I have data, and a lot of this talk is data informed, not just over 17 years, but even based on recent times. So this is really telling to me. What this means is that folks who are thrown into remote work all of a sudden are definitely struggling with it. And we have the data to back that up. So now that the elephant in the Zoom is out of the way, I'm going to continue on and talk about kind of remote work and some of the things I've been hearing and what to do about them. So we did a remote work report late last year at my company, and what we learned in that report, and this was before everyone was just thrown into remote work and working from home, is that 2 things. One, 91% of remote workers said working remotely is a good fit for them. That kind of hits with the sort of satisfaction score for remote work that I just shared. And 96% would actually recommend it to a friend. So what I'm really curious about is, in the next 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, how does this change now that more people are exposed to remote work and have just been thrown into it, and whatever changes happen in the world. So normally remote work is actually loved. So here are a bunch of questions I get about remote work. And these are 5 questions. They're very typical of what people ask. There's multiple sort of audiences and types of people I've talked to about this, and the questions are basically the same. So I'm just going to go one by one and offer my thoughts on each of them, and then we'll open it up for questions. So how do we transition to working from home? At FYI, we did some research about 2 to 3 months ago as we were expanding our product to work for teams. So the product has been really great at helping individuals in an organization or even personally find their documents. And we wanted to basically expand that and go into basically understanding first, what are the problems people have when it comes to collaboration, because that's one of the problems that we're going to be solving. And the 3 sort of top challenges that we found were communication, switching apps, and finding documents. The way we did this research is we actually asked open-endedly people. We asked them basically, what's the number 1 challenge you have with collaborating with your colleagues at work? And then we analyze the results by reading each and every one and then categorizing them. So this isn't like multiple choice where people are biased or filling in things. This is literally them telling us what they think. So on that note, what we actually learned about these 3 is the following. So with communication, it's really about people talking about the challenges in a way where they're blaming the processes or the tools they use. I think this is big. This is a big insight. It actually really maps really well to what I've learned about remote work. Switching apps. So there's lots of apps. It turns out that depending on your size of company, you're probably using 50 to like 300 different apps at work that are software apps. And this really, the frustrations result in all the apps having different interfaces, all the apps having different features, and people being limited by functionality depending on what their preferences are. And then, of course, finding documents is actually the number 1 challenge. We learned about it FYI a long time ago, and this is why we're even building the business we're building. But really, people just complain about information getting lost. So regardless of remote work, regardless of working from home, and regardless of the current business's unusual challenges we face, these are the challenges of collaborating, period. And so what that's meant is that teams have basically slowed down. And then now you're thrown into remote work, so that's a whole added sort of challenge. This is our product. It's at usefyi.com. We are designed to solve these problems, and the main reason I'm sharing it is so that all of you kind of have an option. I'll let all of you folks in that do sign up through this link, because right now we're in sort of a request access mode and have closed sign up. So we're just letting people in somewhat slowly. Okay, so getting to some really interesting things that will be very useful. So, people ask me about how do you deal with this transition, and what you need to do and is basically if I have a system of evaluating how you're doing product development, how things are going. And I don't mean the details yet. I just literally mean what I call the Vacay Method. And it's basically visibility, accountability, communication, and alignment. And the idea here is to score each of these sort of items on the basis of 0 to 5. So 0 being, people don't have visibility, there is no accountability, communication doesn't happen, and there's a lack of alignment. 5 being that we're at 100% on these things and everyone feels like we're great. So you could, if you have a larger team, go have everyone surveyed and survey them and find out kind of what they think. If you have a smaller team, you could go in and basically just talk about this. But this is the method I've been using, even on our own teams, to determine basically how are we doing and where do we need to improve in which of these 4 areas. Because this is literally how I believe collaboration happens. You need visibility on what's going on, what's happening in the business. You need accountability to make sure that everyone is accountable to whatever goals or tasks that they're setting out to do. And you need to communicate. This is big. We obviously need to communicate. Collaboration and communication go hand in hand. And everyone needs to be aligned. And so all these things kind of play with each other. And the first step for me would be scoring yourselves on this, especially as you're now doing remote work. Well, how are we doing on this? Because if you're a 5 out of 5 on all these, or even a 4 out of 5 on all of these before you got into remote work, it's likely the score has dropped. And so this is the assessment I would do. And the main reason is because then you'll know which one of these to improve. For example, if it's an alignment issue, it's likely related to some kind of communication, some type of meetings that are not happening, documentation that's not being written, etc. If it's accountability, it usually has to do with the company as a whole or the product process not having a good QA system or review system or postmortems. So there's a number of different things you can discover when you think about things like this. So next up, and this is my favorite one, especially having built a lot of software and seen a lot of software built over the years, but it's basically what tools should we be using? And so I like to bucket this, especially because of the next piece of feedback I'm going to give and some advice, into 2 categories. There's 2 types of collaborative tools. There's tools that are general purpose, so you have G Suite, Airtable, Miro, Trello, Notion, and many others. And the way I would define general purpose, and the reason I'm bucketing these 2 is because general purpose tools tend to let you get almost anything done with them as long as you know your process and can basically create a process that works with these tools. Specific purpose tools, on the other hand, are tools that more, for lack of a better word, forcefully dictate a process to you, and then you have to use it. And examples of that are like Figma for design, GitHub for engineering, Databox for marketing, and Salesforce for sales, and many others. And so what I would do is evaluate the tools you already use based on, are they general purpose tools or specific purpose tools, and figure out which ones you're using today. Because it's likely the tools you already have are already going to be good enough to do remote work in this new environment. Even though there's a run towards different tools and things like that, you already have the tools you need. I specifically didn't put in Microsoft Teams or Slack or anything in here because those are more messaging tools to me, and those are tools that I'm assuming all companies are generally using right now. And if they're not, it's like the first tool people decide to go to for remote work would be Microsoft Teams or Slack or something like that, so that they can message each other, because they're not able to do that in person anymore. You need a way to message each other. And obviously there's Skype as a tried and true old school, kind of that's how you kind of used to get it done. At least 17 years ago, that's what I used to use. I can't stress this enough, but the process that you use, your product development process, is so much more important than your tools. That's why I start with assessing your process. If you haven't mapped your product development process, go map your process and actually understand all the steps that are required for you to go from, a idea to actually a delivered, shipped product to all customers. That's really critical to map out, especially as you're thinking about sort of and figuring out how to do remote work. And then you can figure out, okay, these are the tools that I need or I already have that are going to help me with this process, instead of trying to pick the tools off first. The only exception I would say was the tools that I didn't mention, which is you do need a messaging tool of some kind, no matter what. And it's likely you're already using one. So I don't like to stress that too much, especially with the sort of proliferation of usage of Slack, which has its own issues. So how do we collaborate successfully? That's the next question. Well, here's a really dead simple way. And it's a way that I recommend, because after years of working remotely, this is what I've come up with. And what I mean by collaboration isn't when you're past 3 people. So this is for things up to 3 people. Beyond 3 people, I actually highly recommend you don't collaborate and try to get things done. It should be done in smaller groups. I've seen this work up to 5 people, but at some point it breaks, and it's usually around there. Around 5 people, really around 3. Right after 3, you start hitting a bunch of issues and things just take longer than they should. I really prefer this method with just 2 people, usually. And so the way we do it and the way we think about it is basically you choose the tool. So let's just use example of Google Docs. So let's say you have a document. The good thing about a lot of these collaboration tools, some of them is not the case, but a lot of them is that while I'm in the tool and someone else is in the tool, we can collaborate together in the tool and we can see what each of us is doing. And so you choose the tool, you get on a voice call. For us, video is optional, and we don't really recommend it usually on these type of collaboration calls because it's not about talking with each other. So it's not about a stand-up meeting or anything like that, or even like a one-on-one where you're discussing things. This is something where your goal is like, hey, let's finish this spec. Let's start this spec. Let's review this spec. Things like that are what you're doing on these kind of calls. And then you have one person share their screen. This is optional because if the tool you're using is highly collaborative and you can already see their faces and what they're doing, you might not need to share your screen. But in the case of a tool like Salesforce, for example, in case you're doing things in there, you definitely want somebody actually sharing their screen, because then you're looking at the same thing. I'm not a fan of people having it open in their own computer unless the tool is very collaborative. And so that's why I mark that as optional. And then you talk and work together, just like you would, almost like you're sitting next to each other and you have a screen open. And it feels good. This is the way that I recommend. Most other things are very complicated. So when it comes to collaborating, for me, it's not about the tool. It's just about picking one. And it's really about, if you're going to do anything with video, really focus on screen sharing, not necessarily a video. And this makes it so you're not distracted by the faces or the people or having to look at their face. Like right now, if you're trying to look at my face and I'm talking, it's probably not a good idea. I probably should shut off my video. Same kind of problem, right? You want to pay attention to the screen that's being shared or the screen that you're working in yourself. And that's why I highly recommend not doing video when you're actually collaborating in this way. Honestly, when you start doing this, it's actually almost like magic, because it's like you're on a phone call and you're just talking about something and you have the screen in front of you and you're actually going into it. So I highly recommend this. How do I keep stakeholders in the loop? So this one is one where there's only one answer. And if I were to give one remote work tip and someone's like, what's your number one tip for working remotely? It's really write it down. Write it all down. And here's just a few examples of how we write it down at our companies and how we think about it. So examples are daily updates in Slack. So everyone in Slack, when they start their day, they're sharing what they did yesterday and what they're doing today. And usually the yesterday is a copy and paste from what you did yesterday and you're writing out today's sort of agenda for yourself. We've found that valuable on remote teams. It's not about micromanaging. It's not about anything except visibility and then alignment. Because then anyone can go in that channel. If it's for a team, the team is doing daily updates. If a whole team, if your team is small, like up to 20 people, 15 people, you're doing it in your general channel. But really, it's about visibility and getting aligned on what everyone's working on. And this is a really impactful, helpful way to do that. It really changed the game for us when we started doing that. And there's some tools that help you do it, but really, you don't really need any tools. You probably just need some rules around it, around how to do it and when to do it. Shared to-dos. So my co-founder and I actually have a document. Before this year, we've been working together for about 4 years, but before this year, it ended up being 400 pages. And the document is literally every day in there, my to-dos and her to-dos and our joint to-dos. And we're just putting them out. So it's like the joint to-dos at the top for, like, let's say today's Wednesday. At the top is anything we do together or anything that is common that we both do, like our daily updates, etc., or a meeting we're going to have together or a demo call we might have together with a customer. And then it's Marie, that's her name, and then her to-dos, and then Hiten and my to-dos. Again, not about micromanagement or any of that stuff. It's about alignment. And sometimes we'll comment on each other's to-dos or discuss things right in that document. But that's been really valuable. It's something I don't see many people do, but it's been valuable, at least for us. So if you have a pairing you have like that in your company that you can do, it can be really powerful. Company news document is something I've seen some folks do where they create a document in reverse chronological order. So the latest one at the top, they're just writing in company news. And that's really helpful because in a remote environment, company news things can be happening and people are just not in the know. All your meetings should have an agenda and next steps. Some people are really aggressive about this where they're like, if there's no agenda, there's no meeting. You don't have to be like that, but I think agendas and next steps are really important and something that we should all aspire to in all of our meetings. And then follow-ups in writing. This one's really important. What I've found is that if you're talking on any kind of call, you should follow up in writing after the meeting just to make sure everybody's aligned on what was discussed. It is surprising how when we collaborate, how much is lost in the conversation and what certain people pick up and others don't. This especially happens when you hit 3 or more people in a meeting, especially virtually, where a follow-up or even someone designated to follow up, someone even designated to write the meeting notes, all that can be really valuable and kind of a game changer. And last but not least, one of my favorites is postmortems, which is the last one that kind of we do a lot of, which is basically making sure that any initiative we do, almost anything we do that is a kind of either customer facing or even internal. We do a postmortem. Some call them retrospectives. You can use 5 whys on them when there's like a problem, like your sort of site went down or something like that. But postmortems are such a big part of doing remote work, and I think doing work in general. You tend to do more of that and write it all down when you're sort of working remotely. Okay, so I have a cool sort of interesting framework that's really useful for stakeholders, regardless of remote work or not. And that framework is, I call it the now and later framework. And so when we're in discussions, especially with stakeholders, especially with other folks on the team too, some of us can tend to sort of talk about things that are important now and things that are important later, almost in the same sentence. And so it's really useful to kind of step back from time to time if you're confused or you feel like you need to define this more of what is important now, what's important later. And this is also related to kind of one of the next things one of the next questions, so I'll share more about it in that question. But really, this is really clarifying because oftentimes we're not necessarily talking about things that matter now. We're talking about things that matter later, and we might just want to get them out and talk about them and put a note for them. But at the end of the day, now is now and later is later. And in this environment where there's a ton of uncertainty, this can be really useful because most people should be focused on now at this moment, just because things are changing day to day for a lot of people. So the now and later sort of also relates to hallway and water cooler conversations for me, because it's just a super related thing. And so usually when you're having hallway and water cooler conversations, it's either about something really strategic and something to discuss and think about later, or something that's really relevant now. And if you can figure out which one of these it is, you're either going to take your conversations and be like, oh, this is for later. Here's some thoughts. Please get to it when you feel like it. And maybe you've written it down. So you're basically writing your thoughts down more. I have, a lot of notes in a few different places, and I tend to pull them up when I need them, and that actually prevents me from actually needing these water cooler conversations if they're about things that matter later, not now. And if it matters now, then the hallway water cooler conversation is different in a remote environment where you can text somebody now, Or you can wait till they're online and text them. Or you can send an email to them, believe it or not, that still works, and let them know that, like, I want to talk about this at some point in the next what amount of time. So one of the quickest ways to deal with this is increase your communication. And that's sort of my biggest tip about a lot of this, which is until you have the proper processes and preferred tools that everyone loves on the team for working from home, I would recommend over communicating, which means more Slack messages, maybe more emails if that's what you're into, more documentation, more write-ups, until you really get a good feel for how your processes and tools need to be set up. And I can't stress this enough, especially in this environment where business is unusual. And it's not business as usual, it's business as unusual. And that focus of like speaking up more, talking more, sharing more of your thoughts is really critical and really important. And that's the way to kind of not worry about hallway or water cooler convos. Those tend to be random, like drive-by convos. I find a lot of value in those as well, even though I've never really worked in an office full time. But on our teams, we're usually just chatting with each other, and we keep it pretty casual. But we're also really sensitive to if somebody is on Do Not Disturb, don't bother them. Write a note and share it with them later, or send it by email, or send it on a slower channel than Slack or whatever you're using. So I know there's some questions here. I think I'm just going to start going after them, and I will repeat them, and I will keep a log of them. So there's 5 questions so far. So the first one's from Jerry. Thanks for the question, Jerry. And he asks, how do you either foster a new or reinforce an existing corporate culture when you turn a company to a remote centric interaction? Okay, so this question about culture is fascinating. I think culture exists, culture isn't really created. And in a remote environment, all of the things I mentioned are going to cause your culture to change. And you're going to have a culture of communication, a culture of writing things down. And so it's the fostering is really about focusing in on that sort of Vacay method I mentioned, because culture from a work standpoint gets defined by basically the work you're doing, the tools you're using, the process you're using, and obviously the people. But you already have the people. The people already exist. That's not necessarily a big important piece because they're already there. So to me, fostering a new or reinforcing the culture, everything tends to change when you go remote and have to follow some of the principles and the things that I mentioned. And so organically, that culture will form. There are some things people like doing, like they will add some added Slack channels to just help people vent, or like some people have created a specific work from home channel. We have a channel for sort of life, where people are just sharing random things about their life, and everyone knows it's a random channel. There's not any work happening there. So people, we have one person who actually lives in a van and travels around Europe, and so he posts these amazing pictures of the different places he's at and the scenery there, the hills and the water and all that stuff, the cliffs and all that stuff, the mountains. So you end up figuring some of these things out based on your team and your culture. For us, there's also a lot of pet pictures in that sort of life channel. So you might need to create some of these things, because those life conversations that sort of help the culture develop about people's lives and just what's going on, it's just very different. Even for us, like when we get on meetings these days, especially with this new work from home reality, the first few minutes are just to catch up, so to speak, so that everyone just feels comfortable, is able to share, vent, whatever. We also do some fun things that we've been doing for a long time, where on our product team meetings, we have what we call an emoji deck. Usually I'm the one making the deck, and it's literally either a word and or an emoji. Usually it's just an emoji and a word, or a set of words with a title, and we're just all going through it, and usually it defines what different areas or different people are doing, and it just adds a little bit of fun and spice to the culture when we're representing some of our work as an emoji. I know it might sound weird, but like it's those kind of things that I would recommend thinking through as to like, how do you make things a little more fun and a little more have a little more color, so to speak, to them in your meetings. Okay, so this is from Alan, and his question is, for leading meetings remotely, any tips on managing conversation for larger groups of 10 or more people and guiding conversations so people aren't talking over each other? Okay, So 10 or more is tricky. Uh, 10 or more usually implies and should imply that one of two things. One, there's one person or a few set of people sharing, either one by one or just one person sharing the whole time. So that type of meeting is relatively easy, kind of like a webinar type of thing like this, where one person talks and then there might be Q&A and then or questions or discussion, we would call it. And in those discussions, you're basically just being really sensitive when it comes to not talking over people. And I think that would apply to even a meeting where it might not be one person talking, you're trying to discuss something. So the rules that I have and that I actually prefer are that whatever material needs to be reviewed either gets reviewed in the first 10 minutes during the meeting, where everyone's individually reviewing it, so everyone's on the same page, or it's reviewed individually before the meeting. I don't prefer one person reviewing the material and talking about it and everyone else listening, because people tend to get distracted in a remote environment when they do that. So it's either take the first 10 minutes to review the material individually or review it before the meeting, make sure everyone gets that done, and then get into the convo. And in terms of talking over each other, I think you just learn it over time to not talk over each other. Even today, that does happen on my team. And what we end up doing is someone just apologizes and then someone just goes. And it's like a normal thing in conversation. So maybe don't worry about it so much. And over time, you figure it out. Even with us having done remote for a long time, we do run into this sometimes, and it's okay. Like, just don't make sure no one's beating themselves up. There's just a politeness to it that you end up having, and things work themselves out. So I think it's a valid concern, but something that you can sort out. And then last but not least, if you're going to have meetings with 10 or more people, make sure there's structure, process, agenda. Don't have those meetings unless there's structure, process, agenda, goals for the meeting. Whatever it is that your flavor of that is, make sure you do that. If you don't do that, these meetings are going to be super messy, like guaranteed. Okay, Shara asked, or basically says, I have experience working with remote teams, but I've always had periodic in-person meetings, traveling to a single office to get everyone together and on the same page, for example. Now that doesn't seem like an option in the near term, do you have any tips on how to build rapport virtually to replace that in-person relationship building time? I have conversations one-on-one with people, even if they're not one-on-ones. I'll have a 5 or 10 minute conversation with somebody who I just want to get to know better, and that's my biggest way to do it. And also when we start talking like about maybe for the first 5 or 10 minutes of a meeting, we're just sharing how we feel. That can be really important. So in our leadership team meetings, there's 3 of us who are executives in the company today, or managers. We tend to have a how's everyone feeling conversation as the first conversation we have. Sometimes it takes 10 minutes, sometimes it takes 20, sometimes longer. My co-founder was moving, so this week, and she's moving during this crisis in San Francisco, so she's only moving a mile though, so we talked a bunch about her move and kind of her thoughts and feelings around it, how she hadn't unpacked yet, and stuff like that. So it's just about building rapport meeting by meeting. And if you need to, and you feel like you just want to talk to someone, just go hit somebody up and talk to them. Obviously, your culture has to be okay with that, but honestly, at this point, a lot of the culture things are thrown out the door because we're all dealing with kind of very different and new circumstances. All right, so an anonymous attendee said, Slack stand-up over video stand-up, why? Okay, so we do engineering stand-ups, and we do a product stand-up every week. The reason we do the Slack stand-up is because we have people in a lot of different time zones, people getting up at different times, and we prefer it in Slack because then you can actually read it. And then the stand-ups can happen asynchronously instead of synchronously. But again, we do some of the engineering meetings and things like that. This is more of like, hey, this is what I'm working on, and here's what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. So the Slack stand-up versus video stand-up, we actually do both. But we don't do daily video stand-ups. We do daily Slack stand-ups, so to speak. And I don't know if I'd call them stand-ups, more so than just people knowing what you're up to, because that can lead to different conversations as a result. Miles is asking, can you speak to starting a new role while in this work from home world? I bet some of our PM community is impacted. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think when it comes to like starting a new role kind of in this work from home world, my biggest piece of advice is like, don't throw away some of the old good habits and rules. And so my first thing I would do in a new role in general would be just talk to everyone I possibly can, especially if I'm a manager or a product manager and I have like other people I need to work with. I would just start figuring out how to have those conversations and set up those meetings. That's my biggest tip. When it comes to starting a role, you have to get to know the lay of the land. One of the lay of the land is people, and that's probably the most important one. Outside of that, I would definitely go figure out like where all the documentation is and where all those things are, but that's pretty standard, even if you're in a non-work from home situation. The key here though, and the biggest challenge that we found, and honestly like our tool FYI is meant to help with this, is we don't, with our product, we don't just help you find information and find documents, we also help you see what's happening at work, because we're showing you a activity feed of all the different changes that are happening in the documents that you have access to. So one of the things we've learned isn't just, oh, go use our tool, but the reason I'm mentioning that is like the visibility aspect of work is definitely greatly reduced, and it can be greatly increased when you start really thinking about what is everyone doing and how can I go just see what they're doing. And a lot of that has to do with looking in Slack for updates or looking in some of these tools or even asking people. But what you don't have is that tap on the shoulder in the same way that you used to. Another thing that I've seen companies do on the remote work side is they still have a buddy system, and they have somebody who you sort of partner with in a way that's already been at the company that is kind of assigned to you, so to speak, where you can sort of ask them questions and things like that. That formality can be really useful too. All right, so Alan's got another one. Alan asks, any tips on process for encouraging creativity and new ideas from the team? In addition to having a shared document or workspace, how else can we keep engagement high and have fun? Yeah, I think fun is important. Engagement is even more important. And it really has to do with lightweight communication and the equivalent of banter. So some of the things that I mentioned about like, hey, it's okay if for the first few minutes of a call you're just checking in on everybody and people are just talking about how their day has been or how their week has gone. I think it's okay. In a normal remote work environment, you would still probably do it, but you wouldn't do it as much as you would do it right now. And already that can encourage some creativity. And then, having some channels that are for fun on Slack, like we don't typically do that, but we have that life channel, which there ends up being a lot of fun. And also like just having a habit of like adding emoji reactions to messages where relevant. So I think there's just a lot of lightweight things you would do, almost like you would do with your friends, that you can do at work. And with remote work, you kind of should. It's okay. Obviously, don't joke around if your jokes are super sarcastic and people might not understand them as much. But overall, like fun is just like, it's something that's built in to some of these tools when you talk about things like emoji and reactions and being able to create channels just for fun. And obviously, let's not forget the GIFs with Giphy and stuff like that. So just add it. And all it takes is one person doing it, and then people will catch on, and, it's fun. So just have fun, like just like you would with a friend. Okay, so Kevin asks, how have you kept the remote teams you've led engaged both professionally and personally? So this question is very contextual to the type of business you're in, the type of company you have. But like, for example, like one of the ways to keep people really engaged professionally is if the product you're building is a product that the whole team, your own company uses and should be using. And so I think that's super important and something I would definitely think through and figuring out how to kind of accomplish some of those types of things. In terms of engagement, personally, I think your one-on-ones and a lot of your meetings should definitely start with and lead with how is everyone feeling. And I know like some people don't like talking about their feelings. My co-founder thinks I don't, but she's very wrong. That being said, she talks about them a lot more than I do. And so I think, and she's very comfortable doing that. Our head of engineering is definitely more like me, whether it's comfort or just doesn't necessarily share feelings unless asked. Just ask people. It's a time when like people might be going through a lot of different emotions and things and worried about things, and it's important to ask them. So I think that's important right now. But in general, with engagement, it has to do with showing you care. And on remote teams, showing you care what leads to better engagement with the team always. And the way you show you care is a lot of one-on-ones time and a lot of like just managing your own emotions too, and your own reactions and your own triggers and being self-aware. So one big tip on remote teams, I think your own self-awareness of how you make other people feel and how you speak to people and the energy you bring to things, I think it has to be increased just because you don't have as much time in person. You don't have time at all in person in these scenarios. So it's really just about, it starts with yourself and your own mood, feelings, awareness of yourself. Thanks for the kind words, Alan. And Jerry, so this is the last question in here. Oh, there's a new one that came in. Great. So Jerry asked, I think the creation of the virtual water cooler for teams is very important. We do it in the form of ambient hangouts. No work performed on that channel, but it's a way to just have people hanging around while they're doing the work remotely. You know, I find this really interesting. If you mean like a call or a phone call or a video call or something like that, where it's always on, I think that's really, to this response to me, like we don't do anything like that. We've been doing remote work for a long time. If you mean like something that's always on, we don't prefer that on our end. We're not folks who would use something like Tandem to do something like that. We might use Tandem for other use cases, but we wouldn't use it to have an always on channel. Although we've heard that some teams are very successful with it. So I think it's a matter of how do you do that ambient hangouts. For me, I respect people's work time too much to do something that's very ambient like that beyond just like a Slack channel. But to each their own, and it's really cultural in terms of how tight knit the folks are. And if you've switched to working from home, this might be something you try out if you think it would work. I've found that it actually decreases productivity, and I've also found that a lot of people over time get really upset about the idea of having this ambient hangout sort of situation if you mean something that's always on, a video or call or something like that. That being said, being able to quickly message somebody and even get on a call with somebody is pretty ubiquitous now. You could do it in Slack. You can do it obviously using Zoom. It's really quick to hit the button, get on a call, and I do highly recommend things like that. But that's usually more one-on-one. How do you kick off a new project while remote? I don't think it's very different, except that you're probably going to have more documentation that you end up producing early on and even ongoing in a project when you're remote. And the main reason for that is because if it isn't written down, it might not be communicated accurately where everyone can be aligned on it. And so we kick off projects by creating a document that's a kickoff. It's like a project brief, write it up, very similar to what you do in person, except like we do have people review it. They might comment in the document, and then we might set up a meeting for it, and then we kick off the project. There's just assets that are created. So like an asset could be a deck that really is used to guide everyone through it. We have everyone review it before we start, and then we go. And we might talk about the deck and the information in it, but really it's that the key is the thoughtfulness around every communication that's sort of, even if it's just two people, but every communication, thoughtfulness has to increase around it and the purpose of it and really defining that. So this is why I mentioned early on where like figure out your process and use the Vacay method to really figure out how to rate where you're at with those sort of 4 different things and score yourselves, and then figure out how you need to change your sort of project processes, your product development, how you kick off things so that you have absolute sort of 5 out of 5s on those 4 things, and you aim for that. And then another thing I would say is we're constantly iterating and reevaluating and doing postmortems on our sprints, our processes, or whatever it is that we're doing, new projects once they're complete or even when we're in the middle of them. I think that evaluation of your process and how people are feeling about it needs to happen sort of on a more regular cadence and more regularly than in sort of a in-person environment. So I think that's it. I haven't seen another one come through. I answered about, I think it looks like almost 9 questions. So yeah.